A single arrow. That's all it took to erase 500 years of Anglo-Saxon England from history. One iron tip falling from the October sky, piercing through the eye socket of a king. And an entire civilization crumbled. The date is October 14th, 1066.
The place is a muddy ridge near the town of Hastings, and the man whose eye is about to become the most famous wound in English history is Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England. But here is what the history books often forget to mention.
Harold was not supposed to lose. His army held the high ground. His shield wall had repelled every Norman attack for nearly 10 hours. William's cavalry charges had broken against English axes like waves against a cliff. By late afternoon, the Norman army was exhausted, their horses dying, their morale shattered. Victory was within Harold's grasp. So how did it all fall apart? How did one arrow change the course of Western civilization? To understand Hastings, you have to understand what was at stake. This was not just a battle for a crown.
It was a clash between two entirely different worlds. Anglo-Saxon England was the last major Germanic kingdom in Western Europe still holding on to the old ways. Their language, their laws, their culture, all rooted in traditions that predated Charlemagne.
The Normans were something else entirely. Descendants of Vikings who had settled in France, they had absorbed the French language, French customs, and French military innovations. They built castles. They fought on horseback. They were the cutting edge of medieval warfare. And their duke, William, had a claim to the English throne that he believed was sacred. William's claim rested on a promise, or so he said. In 1064, Harold Godwinson had been shipwrecked on the Norman coast. William rescued him, treated him as an honored guest, and according to Norman sources, Harold swore a sacred oath on holy relics to support William's claim to the English throne after King Edward the Confessor died. The Normans believed this oath was binding. Harold had placed his hands on the bones of saints and promised. To break such an oath was not just political betrayal, it was spiritual damnation. When Edward the Confessor died in January 1066 and Harold took the crown for himself, William saw it as the ultimate treachery. A man who had sworn before God and broken that oath. In William's mind, he was not invading England. He was reclaiming what was rightfully his. He was punishing a perjurer. God was on his side. Harold had a different version of events. The English claimed he had been coerced, that any oath made under duress was invalid. Besides, the Witan, the Council of English Nobles, had chosen Harold as king. Edward himself, on his deathbed, had reportedly gestured toward Harold and commended the kingdom to his protection. Harold was the most powerful earl in England, the proven warrior who had defended the realm. He was the obvious choice. The crown was his by right of the Witan, regardless of whatever promises he may or may not have made on a Norman beach. 2 men, 2 claims, 2 versions of history, and only the sword could decide the truth. But Harold's problems in 1066 were not just coming from the south. While William gathered his invasion fleet across the Channel, a more immediate threat materialized from the north. Harold Hardrada, the giant Viking king of Norway, had landed in Yorkshire with over 300 ships and 9,000 warriors. He also claimed the English throne, based on an agreement made decades earlier between the kings of Norway and Denmark and the previous English dynasty. September 1066 was the cruelest month Harold Godwinson would ever know. 2 invasions, 2 kings coming for his crown, and an army that could not be in 2 places at once. Harold made a decision that would echo through history. He marched north, not in weeks as medieval armies normally moved, but in days.
His huscarls, the elite household warriors of the Anglo-Saxon nobility, covered 185 miles in just 4 days. It was a feat of endurance that stunned contemporaries.
When Harold arrived at Stamford Bridge on September 25th, the Vikings were completely unprepared. They had left their armor on their ships, expecting no resistance. What they got instead was the full fury of the Anglo-Saxon war machine. The battle was a slaughter. Harold Hardrada fell with an arrow through his throat. His army was annihilated. Of the 300 ships that had carried the Norwegian invasion, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home.
Harold had won. The northern threat was eliminated. His reputation as a warrior king was cemented in blood. But there was no time to celebrate.
3 days after Stamford Bridge, while Harold's men were still nursing their wounds and catching their breath, the news arrived. William had landed. The Normans were at Pevensey. The south was burning.
Here we see the first cruel twist of fate. If Harold had waited just 3 more weeks, the autumn storms would have forced William to abandon his invasion. If the winds had shifted differently, Hardrada might have arrived first, and Harold could have faced his enemies one at a time.
But history does not care about fairness. History only records what happened. And what happened was this. Harold Godwinson, fresh from the most exhausting campaign of his life, had to turn his battle-weary army around and march 250 miles south in less than 2 weeks. William knew exactly what he was doing. Instead of marching on London, he ravaged the countryside around Hastings, Harold's own family lands. He burned villages, slaughtered livestock, and terrorized the peasants.
It was a deliberate provocation. William wanted Harold angry. He wanted him rushing south before he could gather his full strength. And it worked. Harold took the bait.
The English army that arrived at Senlac Ridge on October 13th was not the same force that had destroyed the Vikings. Many of Harold's best warriors had died at Stamford Bridge. Many more were too wounded or exhausted to march.
The Third, the peasant militia of southern England, were still gathering. Harold's brothers, Gurth and Leofwine, begged him to wait. "Let us lead the vanguard," they said. "Let us test the Normans while you gather more men."
Harold refused. This was his kingdom, his people being terrorized. He would face William himself. Pride, duty, anger, whatever drove Harold to that ridge, it would cost him everything.
October 14th, 1066. The morning breaks cold and gray. Harold's army is deployed along the ridge above Senlac Hill, a position of tremendous natural strength. The slope is steep. The ground is muddy from recent rains. Any cavalry charge will have to struggle uphill through difficult terrain. Harold's strategy is simple and sound. Form the shield wall. Hold the line. Let the Normans exhaust themselves against English steel. Do not attack. Do not pursue. Just hold.
The shield wall was the heart of Anglo-Saxon warfare. Thousands of men stood shoulder to shoulder, overlapping their round wooden shields into an almost impenetrable barrier.
The front rank held the shields. The men behind thrust spears over their shoulders or swung the dreaded two-handed Danish axes that could split a horse in two. Against infantry, the shield wall was nearly unbreakable. Against cavalry, it was murderous. Horses will not charge into a solid wall of shields and spear points. They balk, they turn, they throw their riders. The Norman knights, for all their vaunted skill, had never faced anything like this. William's army numbered around 7,000 men, roughly equal to Harold's force, though some estimates put both armies larger. But the composition was different. The Normans had 3 distinct groups: the infantry, the archers, and the cavalry. The plan was simple. The archers would soften the shield wall with volleys. The infantry would engage and fix the English in place. Then the cavalry would deliver the killing blow, smashing through the weakened line with the shock of their charge. It was the standard Norman combined arms approach that had conquered half of France. Against any other army in Europe, it would have worked. The battle began around 9 in the morning. Norman archers advanced and let fly their first volleys, but the English stood on higher ground, and most of the arrows flew harmlessly over the shield wall or stuck in the wooden shields. The archers fell back. The infantry moved forward. Bretons on the left, Flemings and French in the center, William's own Normans on the right. They struggled up the slope, slipping in the mud, and slammed into the English line. The impact was tremendous, a crash of wood and steel that could be heard for miles, and the shield wall held. For hours the battle raged along that bloody ridge. The Normans attacked again and again. The English threw them back again and again. Bodies piled at the foot of the slope. Horses screamed and died with their legs tangled in the mud and the corpses.
The Danish axes rose and fell with terrible rhythm, splitting Norman shields, shattering Norman skulls, cutting down knights and horses alike.
William's brother Odo, a bishop who had no business being on a battlefield, rallied the Norman rear with a club. Bishops were not supposed to shed blood, but apparently crushing skulls did not count. Around midday, disaster struck the Norman left.
The Breton contingent, after being repulsed yet again, suddenly broke and fled down the hill. Panic spread. Rumors flew through the army that William was dead.
The entire Norman line began to waver. This was the moment Harold's brothers had warned about. This was the trap that destroyed so many attacking armies in history.
And some of Harold's men fell into it. A section of the English right, seeing the Bretons flee, abandoned the shield wall and charged downhill in pursuit. It was a fatal mistake. William was not dead. He lifted his helmet so his men could see his face, rode among them shouting, and the rout became a rally. The Norman cavalry wheeled and caught the pursuing English in the open, cut off from the protection of the ridge. They died to a man.
Harold had lost perhaps 1,000 of his best warriors in a moment of undisciplined pursuit, but the shield wall still held.
William tried everything. He ordered feigned retreats, cavalry charges that would turn and flee, hoping to draw more English down from the ridge to be slaughtered.
The tactic worked once, maybe twice, bleeding Harold's army drop by drop. But the core of the English force, the huscarls around Harold himself, never broke. They stood like iron, their axes dripping red, their shields splintered but unbowed. By late afternoon, the battle had devolved into a bloody stalemate. The Norman army was exhausted. They had been attacking uphill for 8 hours. Their horses were dying. Their infantry was decimated. One chronicler wrote that the bodies lay so thick on the slope that the Normans had to climb over their own dead to reach the English line. William was running out of options. If darkness fell with Harold still holding the ridge, it would be a Norman defeat. William's supply lines were precarious. Another day of this butchery would destroy his army. Then William made a decision that would change everything. He ordered his archers forward one final time. But instead of shooting directly at the shield wall, he commanded them to fire high, arching volleys that would fall from above, dropping behind the shields, striking from angles the wall could not protect. It was a desperate gamble. Arrows were running low. Many archers had died retrieving their ammunition from the corpse-strewn slope. But William had nothing left to try. The sky darkened with shafts. The English had no answer. You can raise your shield against a man in front of you. You cannot raise it against death falling from the heavens. Arrows punched through helmets, found gaps in armor, and struck men who never saw the blow coming. And somewhere in that iron rain, one arrow, one single arrow out of thousands, found the eye of Harold Godwinson.
The accounts differ on what happened next. Some say Harold died instantly, the arrow piercing his brain. Others say he survived the wound, only to be cut down by Norman knights who found him crawling in the chaos.
The Bayeux Tapestry shows a figure pulling an arrow from his eye, but that might be a later addition or restoration. What we know for certain is this: Harold Godwinson died on Senlac Ridge on October 14th, 1066.
His brothers Gurth and Leothwine died beside him. And when the Huscarls saw their king fall, when they saw the royal banner of Wessex trampled in the mud, something broke inside them.
The shield wall did not collapse immediately. The Huscarls fought on, selling their lives dearly, surrounded by the bodies of their comrades. These men knew what they were dying for. They had sworn oaths to Harold, personal bonds of loyalty that death could not break. They formed a ring around his fallen body, axes swinging in the fading light, killing Normans until there were no more Huscarls left to kill. The chroniclers say that when the Normans finally reached Harold's body, they could not recognize him. His face had been destroyed by wounds, his armor stripped, his royal insignia lost in the chaos. It was Edith Swanneck, Harold's longtime companion, who finally identified his corpse. She knew him, the stories say, by marks on his body that only a lover would know. But without Harold, Without any of the royal family, there was no one to rally around, no center to hold the line together. The Fyrd, the peasant militia who made up most of the army, began to melt away into the October darkness. They had fought bravely, but they were farmers, not professional soldiers. When the king fell, their duty ended. The Norman cavalry finally broke through the remnants of the shield wall. The slaughter that followed was absolute. The English were cut down as they fled, hunted through the forests and marshes around Hastings like animals. Knights rode them down in the darkness. Infantry cornered them against streams and thickets and killed them without mercy. By nightfall, Harold's army had ceased to exist.
The last stand of Anglo-Saxon England ended not with a great final charge, but with men dying alone in the mud, far from home, their names never recorded. William pitched his tent on the spot where Harold fell.
He ate his victory dinner surrounded by the corpses of 10,000 men. The next day, Harold's mother, Githa, offered William the weight of her son's body in gold to retrieve his remains. William refused. He wanted no shrine, no martyr's tomb where English resistance could rally.
Harold's body was buried in an unmarked grave overlooking the beach, facing the sea he had failed to defend. The conquest that followed was methodical and merciless. William marched on London, burning everything in his path.
The surviving English nobles surrendered one by one. On Christmas Day, 1066, William was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. But the coronation was a farce. During the ceremony, Norman guards outside heard the English nobles shouting their acclamation and thought it was a riot. They started setting fire to the surrounding buildings. William was crowned in a church filling with smoke, surrounded by screaming people, while half of London burned outside. It was, perhaps, an omen of the reign to come. The true conquest took years. The North resisted. The West resisted. Edgar Atheling, the last male heir of the Anglo-Saxon royal line, fled to Scotland and raised rebellions that William had to crush again and again. Hereward the Wake held out in the fens of East Anglia, becoming a folk hero to the dispossessed English, a symbol of resistance that would echo through centuries of legend. William responded to every uprising with systematic brutality that shocked even medieval chroniclers. The harrying of the North in 1069-70 was not warfare, it was genocide. When the Northerners rebelled with Danish support, William descended on Yorkshire with an army and a methodical plan for devastation. His soldiers killed every living thing they found: men, women, children, livestock, even dogs. They burned every building, every field, every store of grain. They salted the earth. They poisoned the wells. For 100 miles from the Humber to the Tees, nothing was left alive. Orderic Vitalis, a Norman chronicler who admired William, wrote that 100,000 people died that winter, not from the sword, but from starvation. Those who survived fled south as refugees, selling themselves into slavery to buy bread. The Doomsday Book, compiled 20 years later, still recorded vast areas as waste, meaning no one was left alive to work the land. Villages that had existed since Roman times simply disappeared from the map, their names forgotten, their people gone. The transformation of England was total. Within a generation, virtually every major landowner in England was Norman or French. The Anglo-Saxon nobility, the earls and things who had ruled for centuries, were dispossessed, exiled, or dead.
The English language itself was nearly destroyed. For 300 years, French was the language of power, of law, of literature. English survived only among the peasants, evolving in isolation until it emerged centuries later as a hybrid tongue, half Germanic, half Romance, that we call Middle English.
But here is the question that haunts this story. Did it have to happen? If Harold had waited for reinforcements, if the arrow had flown an inch to the left, if the Huscarls had held their discipline and not pursued the fleeing Bretons. History turns on moments so small they seem absurd. One arrow, one moment of lost discipline, one king's impatience. Harold Godwinson was not a fool. He was one of the finest commanders of his age. His victory at Stamford Bridge was a masterpiece of speed and violence. He had every advantage at Hastings: the high ground, the defensive position, the shield wall that had held all day. He did everything right, and he still lost. Because sometimes doing everything right is not enough. Sometimes a single arrow falls from the sky and ends an era. William lived another 21 years as King of England. He built castles across the land, stone fortresses that still stand today, monuments to Norman domination. The Tower of London, Windsor Castle, dozens more. He created a new England, one ruled by foreign lords speaking a foreign tongue, one where the native population became serfs in their own land.
He was neither loved nor gentle, but he was effective.
When he died in 1087, he left a kingdom that would never again be Anglo-Saxon. And Harold? His body was eventually moved, or so the legends say, to Waltham Abbey, a church he had founded years before. His grave, if it exists, is unmarked and forgotten. The last Anglo-Saxon king of England, the man who won at Stamford Bridge and nearly won at Hastings, is remembered mainly for an arrow through the eye, a footnote to his conqueror's glory. His family fared no better. His mother Gaitha eventually fled to Flanders and died in exile. His sons tried to reclaim the throne with Irish mercenaries in 1068 and 1069, but both invasions failed. They scattered across Europe. One died fighting for the Byzantine emperor, another vanished into obscurity in Denmark. The House of Godwin, which had dominated English politics for half a century, was erased from history. Within a generation, their very names were forgotten by the people they had once ruled. Harold's betrothed, Edith Swanneck, the woman who identified his mutilated body on the battlefield, disappeared from the historical record. Some say she died of grief. Others say she entered a convent. We do not know. We will never know. Her story, like so many stories of the conquered, simply stops. But consider this. William invaded with 7,000 men. Harold met him with an army battered from Stamford Bridge, incomplete because the southern third had not fully assembled, led by a king who had marched 250 miles in 2 weeks. And still the shield wall held for 10 hours. Still the Normans nearly broke. Still it took a lucky arrow to bring the king down. What would have happened if Harold had arrived with fresh troops? What would have happened if he had waited 3 more weeks for the autumn storms? What would have happened if that arrow had missed? There are no answers, only the cold fact that it did not miss, that William won, that Anglo-Saxon England died on a muddy ridge near Hastings, one October afternoon, when a single piece of iron falling from the sky changed everything. Some battles decide the fates of nations, others decide the fates of civilizations. Hastings was the second kind. When Harold fell, a world fell with him. The Germanic kingdoms that had shaped Britain for 600 years vanished almost overnight. In their place rose something new, a Norman-French ruling class that would eventually blend with the English they had conquered to create a new nation, neither purely Saxon nor purely Norman. The England that emerged would go on to build the largest empire in human history. But it was not Harold's England. It was William's. One arrow. That's all it took. One iron tip falling from an October sky. And in the space between one heartbeat and the next, the arrow that changed England forever found its mark.